This is History Myths and Myth Conceptions, and today's myth conception is Helen of Troy. Helen of Troy, also known as Helen of Sparta, is one of the best-known figures from Greek mythology. And obviously, for hundreds of years, her story has been inspiring countless works of art and produced numerous interpretations and reinterpretations of this character. Over time, especially with all of the film adaptations of the Trojan War cycle, she became some sort of a romantic hero, or a tragic romantic hero, in the eyes of the audience. And quite frequently, people are misunderstanding what this character represented to the ancient Greeks and how controversial she is in the original myths. It must be noted that ancient Greek mythology, or ancient Greek religion, was never unified into one definitive and officially approved set of stories. Which means there were lots of myths that contradicted each other, there were peculiar regional folk stories that could ignore the dominant narrative, and there were authors, poets, philosophers, playwrights, etc., who actively participated in myth building, providing alternative views on the subject and sometimes serious revisions. All of this is fully applicable to the stories about Helen of Troy. There were different myths, not only about episodes like her time in Troy, but pretty much about any other aspect, which includes her birth. Some myths say that her mother was in fact the goddess Nemesis, and also her death. There is even a myth where she hanged herself. And Troy? Well, there are myths that say that she's never been to Troy at all. Obviously, the dominant, the most mainstream version has always gravitated around the works of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And most of the time, Helen was seen as a villain. Helen is a bad guy for the majority of ancient Greeks, not a troubled romantic hero. One of my favorite illustrations of this is a famous work called the Encomium of Helen, a speech in defense of Helen, written by the sophist Gorgias. He's trying to restore the reputation of Helen and persuade everyone that their interpretation of Helen's character is wrong and based on misunderstanding and lies of the poets. Why did Gorgias decide to write something like this? Oh, it was an exercise on the power of persuasion. He's playing the devil's advocate, Helen's advocate, irredeemable character. Gorgias was a sophist. There's a Plato's dialogue named after him. His concern was how to effectively use rhetoric and twist the facts to your advantage. Helen was a great subject for demonstration on how sophistry might work, what set of tools you can employ if you want to prove someone that black is in fact white. So apparently that was the dominant view of the character. But as always, that doesn't exclude alternatives. It is reported by people like famous geographer Pausanias that there were shrines dedicated to Helen and Menelaus. We also know a very interesting anecdote about the poet Stesichorus, who, according to the legend, composed some poems insulting Helen, which resulted in blindness, because you shouldn't mess with divine beings. So he wrote another poem, this time praising Helen, and his curse was lifted. Actually, this anecdote doesn't really say anything good about Helen herself, it just warns people to be careful. The behavior of Helen in the myths is usually a bit disturbing. Even in Homer, which is the default version of Helen, so to speak. For example, in the Odyssey, there's a famous account of Helen imitating voices of the wives of the Greek heroes as she walks around the horse. She suspected that the Greeks, Achaeans, were inside and wanted them to reveal themselves and be killed. And she knew most of them quite well. Yeah, one can argue that it was logical since Helen was on the Trojan side, after all. But at the same time, there are myths that actually it was Helen who waved the torch to signal the troops that the gates of Troy were open, because she was conspiring with Odysseus. We also can mention things like her behavior when her new husband, Deiphobos, brother of Paris, was captured by the Greeks, tortured, and mutilated. And Helen couldn't care less. After all of her adventures that sparked a 10-year-long war, she just came back to Menelaus, and they kind of lived happily ever after. At least in some accounts, which include Homer. Menelaus and other Greek heroes actually wanted to kill Helen, but they just couldn't. Basically, Helen was the person who understood the power of her beauty and used it as a weapon. She was well aware that she could do pretty much anything, and most of the time, there will be no repercussions to her personally. As always, there were other accounts that don't agree with the narrative that Helen and Menelaus lived happily ever after. The sources mention all kinds of things that happened to Helen, which includes stories that she was in fact killed by the goddess Thetis on her way back to Sparta, for the role she played in the death of Achilles. There's a story from the island of Rhodes that Polyxo, the wife of Lipolemus, who died at Troy, tricked Helen into believing that the Erinyes, the Furies, were after her, so Helen just hanged herself to avoid this horror. The list of main myths about Helen is incomplete without mentioning the myth of Phantom Helen, which apparently was relatively popular. There's also a play by Euripides about this version of Helen. And Herodotus was probably supportive of this kind of version because he didn't believe that Helen was in Troy at all. The main idea of this Phantom Helen, or Eidolon, a myth, is that Helen was actually a good wife and she never ran away with Paris. Instead, she had been transported to Egypt. And Helen in Troy was just an apparition, a phantom. Real Helen reunited with Menelaus something like 17 years later. This version of the myth actually also has at least two major variations. So, as you can see, there's much more to Helen than all these modern romantic interpretations. There were different versions of the myth, but most of the time, Helen represented something different to ancient Greeks. An example of a horrible person who was exceptionally beautiful on the outside.